Not many of us will leave our houses or cars unlocked, or leave valuables unattended. But when it comes to information, we tend to be less careful. Just look at the phone hacking scandal. Many of the victims left their passwords set to the factory default setting of password, which made it easy for hackers. It shows that we need to be more careful with information about ourselves and that which we handle for others. So this is what you need to know about information security. Most of us, whether at home or at work, have a huge amount of data on computers, smartphones, storage devices, tablets and on paper. There's so much of it we can become complacent, perhaps mixing everyday documents with sensitive information, then treating them as if they were all just ordinary files with nothing important on them. But what if these files got into the wrong hands? Embarrassment? Inconvenience? Public scandal and dismissal? A lot of information security is about being more aware of the risks we're taking. Personal information may seem unimportant to you, but to a criminal it can be the key that opens doors. We need passwords for everything these days. This is Laura, and she uses them a lot. This one looks pretty secure and she knows not to write it down. But here's the thing. She uses the same passwords for lots of different websites. The same one for her social media as her online auction account, her bank, and her amazing.com account. And for some site she had to register for. Criminals capture usernames, passwords and personal information from bogus sites. It's one of the most common ways that criminals get our details. So using secure passwords is important, but it's also important to use different ones. And passwords are just the first line of defense. For important information, encryption makes it almost impossible for criminals to use the data, even if they do get through to it. That's why people often encrypt data on laptops or USB memory sticks. Encryption is also used to make data transfer through the internet more secure. Websites that are using encryption have an HTTPS address and a padlock symbol. Look for this if you're buying something or using a bank account or getting a quote for insurance, anytime when personal details and information are involved. But what about information on paper? We can be just as careless with written or printed documents. You may have heard of government officials with confidential documents on display, walking past photographers, or putting correspondence in public litter bins. It seems so obvious, but have you ever left any documents with confidential information lying around? In a briefcase, on a desk, or on a computer monitor where someone could see it, copy it, or print it off? Ever hit reply to all on an email and not checked who it was going to? It might just be embarrassing, but it could be worse. A lot worse. Sometimes, though, it's more a case of stopping others gaining access. You wouldn't let a stranger follow you in through your front door. So why do people do this in secure areas at work? It's called tailgating. It might be a little embarrassing to say no or ask for ID, but look what happened in this case. An imposter went into a bank posing as an IT person come to fix a computer. Instead, he installed a small piece of software onto the system which allowed hackers to see what was being typed on the bank's computer and use this information to transfer money from the bank to their own accounts. Criminals tried to do something similar on Laura's computer at home by trying to install what's called malware. Fortunately, she had her antivirus and protection software up to date, and it stopped the hackers before they did any damage. Credit and debit cards are prime targets for criminals. Some clone them, while others watch over your shoulder as you enter your PIN code before stealing your card and using it. Look out for these so-called shoulder surfers and make sure they can't see your PIN as you enter it. Organised gangs of criminals are stealing information at such a rate that the cost of a credit card number and bank account details is about the same as the price of a cup of coffee. Criminals are always looking for new ways to get our information and use it for profit. Here are 3 things that may help to make it harder for them. The first is to be more aware of what information you have, how important it is, and how secure it is. Second is to assess what could happen if you lost it or it got into the wrong hands. And third, make sure you have adequate precautions in place to protect it. Although it may be difficult for us to see the value of the information we handle every day, we need to get into the habit of protecting our own and others' information in the same way as we look after our valuables and the things we care about.
Welcome to step 1. Write a security policy. A security policy should cover the most likely threats to the network and the best ways to minimize them. A risk assessment may be used to determine how likely specific threats are. A risk assessment will often give a dollar amount that it would cost the company should a particular risk be realized, which is multiplied by the number of times that risk is likely to be realized per year. So if a particular risk is estimated to cost $2,000 each time it occurs, and it's likely to occur 3 times per year, then the cost for that risk is $6,000 on a yearly basis. A different risk might be estimated to cost $5,000 each time it occurs, and it may be likely to occur 7 times a year. Then that risk would cost $35,000 on a yearly basis. So it would make sense to give a higher priority to the second risk and to spend more money and time on it. Now, if a risk has a very small dollar amount and it's not likely to occur very often, then you might decide to simply forget about that risk altogether and not even bother with it. Now, you need to be aware that a risk assessment can give you a false sense of security because the risk report gives you specific numbers which seem to have validity, but they don't necessarily, because those numbers are based on guesses in the first place. So just remember, garbage in, garbage out. So when it comes to risk assessments, that's something that you might want to do if you understand the problems with it, but you don't need to necessarily do it depending upon your particular situation. Now, you must make sure to cover any laws and regulations that are applicable to your company. So, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley, most corporations are subject to that. You might be subject to HIPAA if you are a medical company, or if you are using credit cards, there are special regulations for that. So you need to make sure that any of those that your company needs to abide by are in fact included in the security policy. Now, in the security policy, you definitely want to include clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So who is it that's in charge of keeping the firewall updated? Who's in charge of backup? That sort of thing. Next, you want to make sure that you involve management in the creation of the policy, and also make sure that management signs off on the policy. Now, the reason why you want to do this is so that your policy has teeth, meaning that supposing a security analyst in the IT department writes this policy and puts it out, users might simply ignore it. But if the president of your company tells people that they must follow this, then it's likely that they will. You want to make sure that your security policy is a high-level document and understandable by all employees. It should be broad as opposed to technology specific. Writing the policy in this manner has the benefit that the security policy should rarely require updating. Now, based on the security policy, technology-specific procedures can be written. So it's assumed that as time goes on, procedures will need to be rewritten, but the security policy should not. Now, an example of a specific procedure would be what should the person in charge of backup specifically be doing daily to make sure that the backup is done properly. And lastly, you want to make sure to include an acceptable use policy, that's AUP, in the security policy. Now, an acceptable use policy is very specific, indicating to end users exactly what they are allowed to do on the network and what they're not allowed to do. For example, they might be allowed to use internet for personal purposes, or maybe they're not allowed to. Likewise with email, are they allowed to use email for personal purposes or not? Or maybe they're allowed to only use it outside of their shift, that kind of thing. Usually new employees will be required to sign the acceptable use policy at the time that they're being hired, to indicate that they understand it and will abide by it.
Your personal information is spread across many websites throughout the internet. From online banking, credit reports, e-commerce, tax returns, and healthcare accounts, your personal information may be at risk of loss or theft. Most businesses and organizations that you transact with have elaborate security programs to protect your personal information. But this doesn't stop cybercriminals from trying to steal your data. Due to vulnerabilities in software, these cybercriminals can infiltrate and steal not only your data, but potentially thousands of other people's information too. Data breaches and data theft affect millions of people around the world and is on the rise. Many companies have suffered a massive data breach, leading to layoffs, lawsuits, and fraud. Once these cybercriminals have your personal information, they can completely drain your bank account of its funds. A data breach can also result in identity theft, allowing someone else to use credit cards with your name, potentially damaging your credit history. In some cases, data breaches can result in blackmail if the victim was a member of a questionable site or has information they don't want made public. Individual users may be targeted with specifically designed malware that can delete or steal information off of a personal computer. While data breaches can severely impact individuals, businesses and government organizations are usually at a larger risk. Even employees can steal and sell personal information to third parties who use it for criminal purposes. Protect yourself against data breaches by changing your passwords often and using a password manager that generates secure passwords, such as Kaspersky Password Manager. Ensure that any sensitive information that is kept in cloud is well protected and encrypted with the latest security software. Finally, make regular backups of important data on a separate system, such as an external hard drive or cloud, to minimize the risk of losing vital information if a data breach does occur.